Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Dr. Dale Smith, military historian and professor emeritus of military medicine history at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. Today, Dr. Smith talks about key figures from throughout the history of military medicine and looks ahead to the next generation of military medical practitioners. At the 11th Annual Letterman Awards for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, you spoke specifically about Major John Letterman's contributions to creating a medical evacuation for the Union Army during the Civil War. Can you share some insights on Major Letterman's story and what we might learn from his legacy?
Let me start about the time Jonathan Letterman joined the Army Medical Department. When Congress allowed medical officers to get commissions. The medical department was essentially on warrants. They were not commissioned officers. Their sword didn't have a sword knot. They didn't wear epaulets on their coats. But because we were a democracy and didn't have this aristocratic tradition of only aristocrats can be officers, Congress allowed the commissioning of medical officers, first in the Army and later in the Navy. That meant you could sit in a staff meeting. It meant you got some officership education. And so by the time of the Civil War, you have a group of people who think of themselves as staff officers and hospital commanders. That's an important difference from all the other armies in the world. The second major difference is the Surgeon General began to buy books. And when, at the beginning of the war, civilian professors wrote in to the Surgeon General, medicine is changing and you need to get people into hospitals with people that know what they're doing as quickly as possible. Mr. Lincoln had to support more professionalization in Army medicine. And he appointed a friend of Letterman's who had come back on active duty after leaving the Army, a man named William Hammond, as Surgeon General. And in 1862, when McClellan was on the peninsula trying to find the back door to Richmond, he had a problem. His troops were getting sick. It was summer. There's malaria in the river valley. And they were not being evacuated after the battle, because the people charged with doing that were the Teamsters that brought stuff forward. They were supposed to go on the battlefield as contractors and pick up the wounded. Well, it takes a lot of money to convince somebody to go forward to be shot at. And so Letterman went to McClellan and said, I have to have control of the ambulances. Fire the Teamsters, cancel their contract, and give me enlisted people. And he trained those enlisted people to be an ambulance corps. So they would go as soon as there was a lull in the fighting, because they were soldiers too, and they wanted to pick up their buddies and take them back to the regimental hospital. Letterman began to read the reports of the various surgeons, and he was reading the daily newspapers. And with his staff, in late September and early October, they put together a plan. We need control of the placement of hospitals above the regiment, and I'd like to control the regimental hospitals too. But that would get the regimental commander upset. But I need to rate the regimental surgeon at least. I need control of the ambulance corps. Ultimately, I need control of supplies. I need reports. I need to know what's going on, and I need to command this thing as well as be your staff officer. And Letterman realized he began to need a second level of evacuation to move people from the forward hospitals that were backing up the regimental hospitals, corps and division hospitals, back to Washington and Philadelphia and other places. And so after Gettysburg, Letterman is, one, exhausted, and two, has a system. It's a system that picks people up from where they're wounded, takes them to the regimental hospital. He assigns particular surgeons to do surgery, and he says, everybody's got to be checked by a second doctor before you do an amputation, because at both Shiloh and at Antietam, we were criticized for doing too many amputations. He'd looked at all the records. He'd had other people look at the records. They weren't doing too many amputations, but stacks of limbs that got into photographs didn't please the folks back home. So a second opinion system was put in place. Large field hospital to keep care of people if Meade began to chase Lee back, and Meade did, unlike McClellan. Left a huge hospital in Gettysburg under canvas. Sanitary Commission, a voluntary organization kind of like the Red Cross, helped resupply that hospital until they could get enough wagons to move people back. The preposition stuff came up, provided resources and doctors so that Letterman could keep the regular doctors with the Army as Meade moved south. Huge successful system with push supplies and records to know what was going on. This was seen and observed and commented on by many of the foreign observers in the Civil War.
Can you expand a little bit on how medical evacuation and its history and formation have better served the military medical capability of our forces?
Certainly. The tactical change in the Letterman doctrine has been primarily the vehicle. We no longer use wagons. He didn't have anything but wagons, and then for strategic evacuation, he had ships and trains. In World War I, we added trucks, cars, ambulances, but the airplane was in World War I. And people said, maybe we can evacuate people with an airplane. And the general response was, they're kind of fragile. One French general has said, are we not losing enough soldiers on the battlefield that we want to kill them in airplane crashes? After the war, places like West Virginia that were isolated could use aeromedical evacuation on an ad hoc basis to get somebody to a city. In World War II, of course, aviation was sophisticated, matured, and the Army Medical Department, serving the Army Air Corps, the Air Force, began to think about medical problems, both of aviation and of how aviation could help. By the late war, as we had control of the air, in Europe, Malcolm Grow used what came to be called the Grow Escarelle, every small plane he could find to go further forward, take blood, take supplies, and bring wounded back at a tactical level. They'd seen a doctor, but they by no means gotten definitive care, and they needed to get to a hospital. Railroads were all bombed up. Roads were all bombed up. How did he do this? He had built a rapport with two line generals, Eisenhower and Bradley. One commanded everything, and one commanded everything in Europe. And they said, that's a good idea, make it work. After the Second World War, helicopters began to be developed. And a young doctor in the Surgeon General's office named Spurgeon Neal got himself put on a commission to study the helicopters in 1949. And he said, we need a stronger helicopter. The Huey came in Korea. And he was sent to Korea, and he saw the Hueys being used. Now, they were not used medically. These were Air Force evacuation helicopters set up to rescue downed pilots. But we weren't losing enough pilots to keep them busy. And so the Army asked them to go pick up patients at the battalion aid station and bring them back to the MASH. Well, it was kind of ad hoc, but it made a lot of sense. So 8th Army asked for its own helicopter evacuation system. When Spurgeon Neal saw this working, he says, that's a medical asset. And so he fought through the Surgeon General's office after the war to set up an aeromedical evacuation system with Army aviation. He built such a system that he was designated as the medical doctor to Westmoreland's staff in Vietnam. And he got medical control of the evacuation helicopters. It resulted in a phenomenal drop in the died of wounds rate in Vietnam. And that dust-off system that Neal pioneered there was, of course, spread to everybody else. In 1968, the National Academy of Science did a study on injuries in America and said the wounded in Vietnam are getting better care than people on the highways in accidents in America. We need helicopters. Now every hospital has a helipad. I'm not telling a land war story exclusively. Again, in Korea, the ad hoc use convinced a Navy surgeon who was there, a man named Joel Boone. He was a medical inspector at that point, very senior, kind of like a deputy surgeon general. He said, if they can fly them to Army hospitals, why can't we fly them to hospital ships? Well, there's no place to land on a hospital ship. So he had a raft built beside the hospital ship. And to prove it would happen, this retirement-eligible Navy doctor flew out on a helicopter and shinnied down a rope to get on that raft, called the helicopter down to land on it. And hard to turn the admiral down if you're a Marine helicopter driver. And so they did that. And all right, it's doable. Now refit some of these things and put a deck on the back so that people can land directly on the hospital ships. So Navy and Marines got helicopter evacuation almost as quickly as the Army did.
You know what's amazing is thinking about, particularly in Vietnam, which was a war that didn't really have a front line. And you could have a battle occurring almost anywhere in the country simultaneously. And the fact that we were able to perfect a system to get helicopters into the hot zone, pick up your wounded and get them out, and do it better than the way that states and localities were dealing with car accidents here on the peaceful mainland is incredible to me. And that's just, I didn't know that. I don't think most people knew that. And I think that's an important point to stress, especially when you're talking about a war like Vietnam, where, you could have a battle anywhere on any given day at any moment, and they were still able to make sure that they were able to evacuate their wounded when and where necessary. That takes some incredible planning, I would have to imagine.
Well, it takes planning. It also takes people that are willing to do things for which we reserve the Distinguished Service Cross and the Medal of Honor. Not all of them got out safely, but it was a phenomenal system. It's still a phenomenal system. In the global war on terror, our helicopter evacuation was so effective that we could meet the civilian golden hour standard that had been set for emergency trauma in the 1970s in civilian medicine. First time in history that every wounded soldier or Marine reached medical care, definitive medical care, surgical capacity, within an hour of being wounded. But there's going to be a tactical impossibility in peer war where drones and missiles are so increasingly common. And we need to begin to prepare, and some people are working on it. Some of my former students, in fact, are working on how to get care further forward, how to hold people a little longer safely until you can evacuate them, because we need to think about those things as little as we want to.
Join us for part 3 of my conversation with Dr. Smith, where we discuss additional key figures from military medicine history and key lessons we can learn from their legacies. For everyone listening, we look forward to continuing the conversation. As we commemorate 250 years of military medicine, join us wherever you get your podcasts, on health.mil or on any of our social media channels for the most up-to-date military health content.